Here's a public apology to Dan McClellan. Dan, I jumped on you too quickly. I confused Jesus being represented as God with Jesus representing God.
Thank you for the apology, Jacob. I appreciate it, and I have no reason to believe it is anything other than sincere, so I consider this matter closed and behind us and no longer an issue. And I apologize if folks have come over from my account to leave mean or harassing comments on your videos. That's the last thing I want, which is why I always include warnings on my response videos not to harass or report or comment on the appearance or speech of folks to whom I am responding. And when I become aware of harassing or threatening or otherwise inappropriate comments on other people's videos from folks who have been on my account, I block them, whether or not they are followers of my account. So I hope that will not be a problem for you in the future, but I hope you will let me know if it is. But you wanted to talk about the rest of your videos, so let's take a look at the rest of your argument.
He goes on a rant about how Exodus 23 talks about a messenger that is not God, but bears God's name. And what was the point of this? No point whatsoever. He actually proved my point, because he admits that this messenger in Mark refers to John the Baptist and not Jesus.
No, I quite clearly mentioned that the point was to evoke this idea of the messenger who bears God's name and so exercises God's authority. And in Exodus 23, the thing that the messenger is said to be able to do is have authority over sins. The thing that Jesus is going to say he has authority over in the very next chapter. So it's not saying the messenger is Jesus, it's saying the messenger is John. But by appealing to a longer direct quotation from Exodus 23 rather than the shorter quotation from Malachi 3, the author is reminding the readers of this concept. This was a very famous passage that is quoted in a number of different texts that have to do with divine mediation. And so we're just evoking that concept for the hearer to set the table for what's going to come in the next chapter. It's literary creativity.
And then Dan appeals to authority to structure power over and against Christian groups.
This is not difficult. You just have to want to understand the author on their own terms rather than force the author to agree with your terms. And that is the biggest problem with your hermeneutic.
And my commentary was exactly right, as we're going to see in the rest of this video.
So Dan totally ignores that the Septuagint translated the Hebrew Yahweh as Kyrios.
I don't totally ignore it. In fact, I directly and explicitly address it.
Then Dan gives examples of when Kyrios doesn't necessarily have to mean Yahweh. I mean, do you see the problem with this? It doesn't matter what the word can mean in other contexts. What matters is what the Septuagint translated in this particular passage.
No, that is not what matters. It is precisely how the term is being used in other contexts, because the author of the Gospel of Mark is deploying this quotation in other contexts for their own rhetorical purposes, and they're altering the quotation to better fit that other context in light of their rhetorical goals. So that is the proximate context for the use of the quotation, and that is the context that determines how the author wants the quotation to function. Therefore, that is what matters, how the author of the Gospel of Mark uses the term.
Let me illustrate. If I'm having a conference about chips in Indonesia, and the interpreter translates chips as kripik, what does kripik mean? Well, it means exactly what I said. It means potato chips. But after the conference, one of the participants says, well, hold on here. Chips does not always have to mean chips. It can also mean fries. So I think that Jacob was talking about French fries. But no, I was clearly talking about potato chips. So you can't just say, but hey, it can also mean this. But this is exactly what Dan McClellan does.
This is an entirely false analogy, because the interpreter at a conference is not creating their own literary composition for their own target audience, for their own rhetorical goals. They are simply transmitting a message from the originator of that message to the originator's own target audience. If you wanted an analogy to what the author of the Gospel of Mark is doing with a passage from the Septuagint, you would have to talk about someone centuries down the road who is creating their own literary composition for their own target audience, for their own rhetorical purposes, who uses that word to mean both chips and French fries, who then goes and draws a passage from the translation and alters it to better fit the context in which they are placing it. Then we can ask the question of whether or not in that context the term was intended to mean chips or French fries. That would be a far more accurate analogy.
The Septuagint translated Yahweh as Kyrios, and the context does not allow us to understand Kyrios as anything other than Yahweh. Why? Because God himself speaks to the prophet and says that the messenger will prepare the way before God himself.
So this would be an accurate argument if the Septuagint were the context, but the Septuagint is not the context. The Gospel of Mark is the context, and the author of the Gospel of Mark is deploying the Septuagint's translation and altering it. Because you'll note that what God said to the prophet was, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. And then Mark changes it, say, I am sending my messenger to prepare your way. So we have altered the text to fit a different context. That is the context that is relevant to interpreting the author of the Gospel of Mark's use of the quotation of the Septuagint translation of this Hebrew Bible passage.
But Dan looks at this and goes, it is extremely unlikely that Lord means something other than Yahweh here, but there's a slight, tiny little possibility that it doesn't, because Lord elsewhere can mean something else. So you're telling me that there is a chance. Let me just ignore Isaiah and Malachi and make an argument here based on what is not impossible.
So Jacob here is rather clumsily trying to turn my own rhetoric around on me and accuse me of what I point out that apologists have long been doing, which is starting from a dogmatic conclusion and then dodging and skirting their way around the data so that they can arrive at the conclusion and say, see, the data don't render my conclusion impossible. Now, there are multiple reasons that I'm not doing that, but in this particular instance, probably the main reason is that this is not my argument. I'm borrowing the scholarly consensus. If you want to see the argument that I originated, you can go read the book that I pointed to in my previous video where I talk about how the reason they're doing this with the Gospel of Mark is because of the underlying intuitive logic of divine images. But the notion that the author of the Gospel of Mark is intentionally deploying the term Kyrios ambiguously so that they can say Jesus is not God, but Jesus has some kind of exceptional, special intimacy with God so that what Jesus is doing, God is doing. That is the scholarly consensus. And I have pointed to a number of commentaries and journal articles and other publications that demonstrate that. So you can go check those out if you would like to see that that is the scholarly consensus. But this is not my argument. This is what the majority of scholars agree on. And that's not to say it's true, but it is to say that this is not me beginning from a dogmatic conclusion and then just trying to gin up some kind of argument to make it sound not impossible. This is me just endorsing what the majority of scholars already agree is most likely. And that's not to say because the majority of scholars think that it's true. It's to say the majority of scholars think that, and if you want to argue against that, saying Dan's just making this up isn't engaging the argument. It's dodging the argument and dismissing the argument as if I'm the one who came up with it, and I'm not.
Then Dan goes on to further build his case on how Mark shortened his quotation of Isaiah.
So this is an example of beginning from a dogmatic conclusion and then dodging and skirting your way around the data to argue that your conclusion is not impossible. Because Jacob's already argued that the context of the Gospel of Mark is irrelevant to what these quotations mean within the Gospel of Mark. Jacob is arguing that all that matters is the context of the Septuagint. And even though the author of the Gospel of Mark is altering the quotations, it's the original quotations that matter, not the altered form of the quotations in the context of the Gospel of Mark. Because we've already seen a change in the quotation of Malachi 3/Exodus 23, where in the original Hebrew and in the Septuagint's translation, it is, I'm sending my messenger before me to prepare my way. Whereas in Mark, it is, I'm sending my messenger before me to prepare your way. We've changed the referent from me, namely the God of Israel, to you, Jesus, who is in some sense Kyrios. Now, Isaiah 40 verse 3 has also been changed, where in the Hebrew and in the Greek, it originally ended, make straight the paths of our God. In Mark, it says, make straight his paths. So just like the parallel Septuagint passage, this has been changed, so the referent changes. So it's not a reference to our God, it's a reference to him. Who's him? Obviously, Jesus, who is in some sense Kyrios. If Kyrios was intended to be understood to mean the very God of Israel, why the change from our God to him? Why not just leave our God? And Jacob's argument is, oh, he's just shortening it. But there's no indication the author of the Gospel of Mark needed or wanted to shorten it. That's just an arbitrary assertion. He had to shorten it. It means nothing. Obviously, it means something because it is the exact same kind of change that was made to the previous passage, which, by the way, is lengthened by the change and by the appeal to Exodus 23 rather than Malachi 3. This is an attempt to wind and dodge one's way around the data to show that it's not impossible to arrive at the desired conclusion. And Jacob is making this argument because he knows that his own audience will agree with him, will be primed to accept this inferior argument because they want this argument to succeed. And that's all he needs. He doesn't need to engage with the scholarship. He doesn't need to care what I have to say. He just needs to perform confidence and competence for an audience that really wants him to succeed. And that's what this is all about. This has absolutely nothing to do with actually engaging my content, which Jacob has not yet adequately done. And the fit for this video has been bizarro.